So, like, first of all, like, can you introduce yourself for the audience?
Sure. Yeah. So my name is Dan. I work as a physiotherapist in Sydney, in Australia. I've been in Sydney for about 8 years now. Some areas of interest. I work with an NBL one team here in Sydney, which is the basketball league here in Australia. Outside of that, I was a CrossFit coach for about 10 years. Did CrossFit for about 10 years as well. And prior to that, played basketball and volleyball growing up. So grew up in Hong Kong. I spent about 13 years there, and then went to school in the States. Was there for 4 years at a university called Calvin University. My first degree was actually in advertising and marketing, so completely different from what I'm doing now. Worked in the advertising industry for about a year in Seoul, South Korea, and after that, that's when I started getting into the I guess you could say the sporting scene. And I haven't turned back since. I did my master's degree here at the University of Sydney in physiotherapy, and I've been working in a private practice coming up on 3 years now. So that's a little bit about me.
Cool. So, I've I've noticed that some of your posts is about like the French ball system. So, when and how do you like start to get interested in this approach?
Yeah, great question. So I work at a private practice in Sydney called Proform Physiotherapy, and since I've been there, again, that's coming up on 3 years now. It's a system that they've used, and it's something that I've kind of grown into while working there as well. And um, the Franz Bosch system, I know we're breaking down a little bit of what it is today, but it's complex. It's a completely different language in itself, and uh, e- even if you get the book one day, I think it's a bit like the Bible. You read it, and then you see something new every time you read it. So it's I've been looking at it for about the past two coming up on 3 years, and it's just something that we use with a lot of our athletes, especially. We do use it with some of our general population as well, but I think we see better transferability into sport when we use it with people at kind of like this higher athlete level.
Cool. So, why do you think that it probably works better than traditional approach?
Mm. Uh, Oh, so many reasons. I think one is the variability of it. I must admit that before coming into a physiotherapist, I was very much so of the like your classical strength and conditioning before I even got into the CrossFit scene. Lots of plyometrics, lots of strength work, lots of change of direction things as well. But I think what's different about Franz, and the principle's been around for quite a while, but I think Franz Bosch kind of packaged it into this system really well. And it's this whole idea of training with perturbations, training with instability, um, to to almost elicit this reflexive pattern in the human body, right? So I think lots of times with your traditional approach of strength and conditioning, it's for the most part quite forward, backwards, left to right. Not even a whole lot to left to right, but it's very like everything's happening in the sagittal plane, right? With these hip locks, with co-contractions, with perturbations, I think there's a better, in my opinion, I think there's a better carryover into sport because sport is not one dimensional. Hardly ever does it happen in a pure sagittal plane. Yes, there's an element of it, but there's so much rotation. There's so many little things going on, and this is the Bernstein principle as well, right? Let's say we're imagining a shot. No one shot is going to look the same. And I think if you're training over repetition versus through variability, I I think we can both appreciate the fact that no one shot's going to look the same. So why should our training look the same every single time? Like how is a back squat, a pure back squat, going to carry over into something like a vertical jump, right? There's so many little different factors going on. I think that's where Bosch's systems, they work really well, and they probably touch on things that traditional approaches don't. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, of course, of course. I love
Yeah,
that. So
yeah.
you mentioned like hip lock, co-contraction, like muscle
Mm,
slack or perturbation. So like
mm,
for those like who are not familiar with like the French ball system, can you like talk a little bit about like what is the concept of hip lock and
mm.
how to like implement it into like your like rehab or prehab or the concept to build bring this into like training.
Yeah, yeah. Good question. So, well, okay, I'm gonna try simplifying this as much as possible. So um, the hip lock, it's a stable position of the pelvis, right? So if you imagine, let's say we're doing a hip lock with your right knee coming up towards your chest. Um, you have what's called triple extension. You see it a lot in Olympic weightlifting as well. So that's plantar flexion of the foot, that's extension of the knee and extension of the hip, and that's a triple extension. And so what the hip lock is really applicable to running, jumping, and most track and field sports, right? And it's this position that's stable, and it's a level position at the top. We talked about triple extension, and then it's also like this. It's a high knee on the swinging leg, which creates this hip lock. And I've been asked this question before as well, in terms of where do you put it into your rehab? And I think the really cool thing about this hip lock is, yes, you see many different variations of it, and I think it's really dependent on how acute, let's say, a person is coming into you. So let's say, for example, as a physiotherapist, we see someone come in with like an SIJ dysfunction. We might start off with like an isometric hip lock hold up against the wall, but then that eventually progresses into something where they maintain a hip lock, but they add another movement into it. And then from there, it's another progression of, all right, let's get a hip lock with some counter rotation movement as well. So this is where we might introduce the use of bands coming across the side and across body. So if you imagine, let's say we're now at end stage rehab and we need to get someone back to playing at game speed. Let's say in the context of basketball, I think we both know that there's a lot of cross body things happening in the sport of basketball, and but I think the main thing of when to implement this hip lock and how to implement it and what it looks like is it needs to look as similar to their sport as possible, right? So for example, I'm most likely not going to give a hip lock to a swimmer because there's not much carryover. Yes, there might be an element of it coming off of the diving board or the start block, sorry. But in their sport, there's not much of it. Whereas for basketball, volleyball, tennis, Olympic weightlifting, there's a lot of this hip lock that's happening. And essentially, what we're trying to do is create a stable position within the hip or within the pelvis. Um, but it's going to look different at each stage of the rehab, right? Starting off with, let's say, isometrics, or even just understanding what all these co-contractions need to look like. And then from there, making it look as similar to what they need to get back to. Mm,
So the hip lock, there's like one
mm.
side of like can I say it's like full extension and the other side is probably like full flexion? Is it am I right?
Kind of, yeah. Let me show. I feel like it's easier to visualize.
Okay.
So if I don't know how good this is going to be. All right, let's say, for example, if I'm in this position here,
Yeah.
right, in that position there, right
Yeah.
now, I know you can't see my foot, but I'm in plantar flexion, I'm in
Yeah.
knee extension, and I'm in hip extension,
Yeah.
right? With this, so that hip lock position that we're looking at from the front on is kind
Yeah.
of that position there,
Yeah.
right? So yes, there's definitely extension of the side that's on the floor, and there's going to be a little bit of there's going to be flexion of the hip that's off the floor. Mm.
Great.
And it's almost like if you imagine like a like a towel that you're trying to ring up,
Yeah.
like it's almost like we're trying to do that within the hip to make it a stable position.
So why is it like helpful in what I mean, why is it like helpful for like sports like sprinting or like
Mm.
football, those kind who need to like sprint a lot instead of like just
Yeah,
focusing on uh pure like power output, like just power clean, that kind of stuff.
yeah. So I think the reason that it works so well with football with track, we're looking at force going through all three joints, right? And even above. If we're thinking of let's call it a leak in one of those. Let's say you have an athlete that just has really poor ankle stiffness, and with their hip lock, they can't actually get into plantar flexion of the foot. There's going to be a leak when it comes to actually let's say going for a full out sprint, right? Or for example, if people don't know how to contract the glute max to get themselves into hip extension, there it's going to go into another part of the body, and I think that's what we see a lot where when we're assessing people with this hip lock. If someone doesn't have good glute max contraction, the knee is usually one of the first things that we see start to go a little bit. People start getting like this meniscus pain, or some like quad tendinopathy. And that's usually because it's either hamstrings aren't firing, or glutes they don't know how to co-contract or contract even, um, to get this power output. Right. I think we always say one of the things we always say, you're better off using the bigger muscles than the smaller muscles. Yes, you have to use them in conjunction, but if you have this massive hip extensor in your glute max that's not going, what something else has to take over, and what that is going to be different for everyone. But we see it manifest, especially in something like the hip lock.
Cool, love this.
Mm, mm,
So
mm.
uh besides the hip lock, you also mentioned like muscle slack and
Yeah,
co-contraction. Like what exactly is like the concept of like slack, and how is it different with uh shortening cycle?
yeah. Okay. So muscle slack. If you imagine, all right, if you've got this cord here, right? Let's say this is your Achilles tendon, for example, right? If you imagine the Achilles tendon kind of in that position there, when you go to toe off or when you go to sprint, there's currently slack in that tendon at the moment, right? What we're trying to remove is that muscle slack. So we actually want this so that when you go to push off, your muscle doesn't need to first remove the slack and then go, but instead it's already in this contracted position so that we can then produce the amount of force that we need to, right? So if we're thinking about force sharing, and I did a post on this a couple days ago, but it's important that we force share. So isometrics, they remove muscle slack, right? So if you think about an isometric contraction of the gastroc and the soleus, that's then going to tighten that Achilles tendon, right? And then so from there, the forcing, it helps transmit force onto fascia by stretching it. Okay, and this fascia, which is like kind of this, you can imagine it as like a cling wrap that goes around your muscle there. Um, it shares the forces with the surrounding fascia and muscles as well, right? So that allows it to work as one unit. And one thing that we do know is that fascia runs over multiple joints, right? So if we use the ankle and the knee, for example, um, because the force is being transmitted through the fascia, that induces joint coupling because the fascia is running around, let's say, ankle, knee, and now hip, right? So I use the example if the knee wants to flex, the hip also wants to, and that's because the fascia is running across multiple joints there. So that's the idea of muscle slack. So I think simply put, we want as little muscle slack as possible, so that we can so that we don't have those leakages or that force is produced, and not wasted through that pre-tensioning that needs to happen where before there's no more slack, if I can say that.
Yeah.
And then yeah.
So how if like let's say if I'm gonna is it like I'm gonna train that or how can I train this concept?
Yeah, good question. So if you think about there are many ways to train it. I think that's one thing to consider. And if we stay on the topic of the hip lock, right? Um, with the hip lock, when your foot's in plantar flexion, that is we've taken out the muscle slack, right? So you can use isometrics to remove muscle slack, and I know I'm using the example of that of the Achilles tendon, but if we put it in the context of, let's say, the hamstring, um, if you have, let's say, a hip fold position on the wall, so if you can imagine that you've got one foot on the ground, you've got one foot on the wall, and we're hinged over, almost like you're doing a single leg RDL, right? In that hinged over position, that's still an isometric contraction because there isn't a lengthening or there isn't a shortening of the muscle. Then from there, if we use, let's say, an aqua bag or some sort of perturbation to go from left to right, for example, we're still taking out muscle slack, but we're also doing that through the use of co-contractions as well, right? So in terms of how to train it, you can remove muscle slack by doing isometrics. But I think what's important is that we're still looking for transferability into sport, right? So whether it's through the use of something like a hip lock or something where we're very conscious of ankle stiffness, right? I think one thing that we see a lot with people that come in with Achilles tendinopathy is that they don't have the control to actually stay plantar flexed when they're jumping, right? So if you think about how that transfers over into the context of something like sprinting or running, if you've got a heel that's hitting the ground every single time, like every single time you run, you can see how something like that might aggravate an Achilles tendon, right? So taking out muscle slack and increasing, let's say in the example of an ankle, increasing ankle stiffness is one way to train that. So you've got things like pogos where you're on 2 feet and kind of hopping. And what we're looking for is not that heel to be hitting the ground, but you actually want the ankle stiffness on every single one that you do there. And that's one way to train removing that muscle slack there.
Cool. So,
Mm.
uh, there's also like co-contraction. So, uh, is it kind of the same with like what you just mentioned, like muscle slack?
Yes. Yes, but I think they are different topics. So co-contractions, I think, by definition, it is an isometric contraction performed by the agonist and antagonist muscle, right? So if you're thinking about the quad and the hamstring on either side, they need to co-contract. And yes, that can be done through perturbations. It can also be done through time pressure and pre-tensioning as well. So if we're looking at the reason behind why we want to work on co-contractions, uh, it works as a way to self-stabilize muscles. Um, it dissipates, so it lessens the force, the peak forces, and that's by tensioning the fascia, which is what we talked about a little bit earlier. Um, and then there's also this thing of decreasing degrees of freedom, right? So if we think about degrees of freedom in something like the hip, by co-contracting, we're decreasing the amount of freedom, which sounds like a bad thing, but it's a good thing when I think when we're trying to be stable through the hip, right? So it reduces that and it resolves the context related variability as well, right? So if we're looking at what that looks like within a sport, we by having co-contractions, let's say in a movement, um, let's say you're at the top of the key and you're jab stepping, right? And you might train that, for example, with an aqua bag where you start here and you jab down and you come back up, right? With your body learning how to co-contract in that movement pattern, when it comes to actually doing that within your sport or within a game, your body's been exposed to that variability so that when it comes time to do it at game speed, it already recognizes that pattern that you're doing. So it's not so much a responsive thing, but it's a reflexive thing because you've trained it, right? And I think one thing that we talk about a lot with Franz Bosch is that reflexes are much faster than reactions, right? So you want to be reflexive to a movement than reactive to a movement because the time is it's extremely, I mean, it's different. And in professional sports, it's a game of milliseconds. It's a game of hundreds of seconds. And if we can train those little things, I mean, that's a difference between you being good and you being great, right? And yeah, the last thing with co-contractions, it overcomes muscle slack by pre-tensioning, and that's kind of what we talked about uh, just before.
Yeah, so you
Mm,
mentioned that uh it's uh reflexive over like
yeah,
reactive, right?
yes, yes,
So that's also why there's like so much different like core training or like special strength training comes along with.
mm, mm, yeah,
So can you like because there's a lot of like movement about like these like core training and some of like the sports specific like strength training, can you like
yeah,
introduce some of it to us?
yeah, of course. So with core training, uh, I forget the name of the researcher, but there's a research paper out there that says the first thing to contract in any movement is going to be your midline or your core, right? So it's this pre-tensioning of your core before you do any sort of movement. If I go reach for my water bottle, the first thing that contracts is going to be my core. So I think core training. I mean, again, this is me coming from like this very traditional like gym slash CrossFit training. A lot of what I I did then was very sagittal, right? Very up and down, like trunk flexion, trunk extension. Obviously some things with twisting, but for me, yeah, and I think this has changed a lot in the past 2, 3 years. Um, is that the core training has to look like what you do in sport, and I think this ties into the special strength training that you mentioned too, right? With basketball, with football, with tennis, there's with most sports actually, there's this rotational movement that happens to one extent or another. Um, and I think there isn't enough anti-rotational stuff that's being done within sports at the moment or within traditional programs at the moment. Like, yes, you can plank, yes, you can side plank, but if it comes to you having to grab a ball from your left hip up to your right hip, or vice versa, or you coming from up down to down low, you see a lot happening in kind of this X pattern or this rotational pattern around the body. And that's where a lot of the core training that I give to especially basketball athletes is surrounding. Like, yes, there's an element of flexion and extension of the trunk as well. But things that I do for core training, let's say you're holding onto an aqua bag here, like doing lots of twists, going from side to side. Even with bands, like you've got your Pallof presses, and I think that's a very like that's a very basic example of counter rotation movements that you can do. Things with slam balls where you're going from left to right, and just trying to recreate a similar amount of force that they might feel within a game in what they're doing for training so that they feel prepared, if not over prepared for what they need to do in game as well. I hope that answers your question with core training.
Yeah, but
Hmm.
like you mentioned like the pillow press or like the med
Yeah,
ball slam. So
yeah.
why don't we just is you use like alcohol bag with like
Hmm.
prohibition? How is it exactly different with like the pillow press and
Yeah,
the med ball slam?
yeah. Great question. I think all like the aqua bag, it's one tool, right? And I think I think sometimes, and I'm guilty of this as well. I think sometimes it's the easiest thing to go to because it's a piece of equipment that creates this variability, that creates this instability. And I guess the difference between this med ball slam and the Pallof press versus the aqua bag, the aqua bag is it's an uncontrollable variable, and I think that's what we're trying to train. I think especially in sport, we're trying to we're trying to essentially give them as many different variables as possible within the limits of their learning, to then get them to self-organize. And I think that's the one of the main parts of the aqua bag is that sort of instability is creating stability within the organism or within the athlete there, right? So, um, yes, there's a place for the med ball slams, and sometimes it comes down to availability as well. And I think this is going to be different from person to person. If someone doesn't have access to, let's say, an aqua bag, the Pallof press, let's say, with a plate in between to add that sort of perturbation, is something that we can use for it. Um, Again, it's lots of different factors, and I think it's also dependent on athlete to athlete. Like I won't use an aqua bag with one basketball athlete compared to another. If there's even if it's something as simple as I don't want to use the aqua bag when I'm in a commercial gym, right? And I completely understand that it looks very strange if you go into, let's say, World Gym, you take an aqua bag with you and you're doing all these things. Like there is that element too. So I think there are lots of things to consider when prescribing exercise, and you would know that as a performance coach as well, that not one exercise is going to work for every single person there. And it's exactly the same thing with core training. And I think the main thing that I'm looking at as a physio is where can I get the most buy-in from this athlete? Do they see how this is going to transfer over into their sport? If I can tick a couple of those boxes, then I'm probably going to go with that exercise. And it might look different for every single person.
Great, great. So that
Mm,
also works with like the sports specific like strength training, right? I saw
mm,
there's going to be a lot of like single leg like
mm.
clean that kind of stuff, or
Yeah,
uh
yeah.
like some sort of movement like lunges, but it kind of implement the hip lock
Mm.
with the movement or some sort of like um co-contraction. Am I right?
Yeah, so with the let's use a single leg clean, for example. I mean that's definitely something that implements a hip lock, but with more velocity, right? And um, there is a transfer over from that into any sort of sport where there's this push off that's happening. So with track and field, with running, with basketball, with any sort of jumping sport, there's a transfer over for that. I personally think, and I know I might get a bit of backlash for this. I think sports are going to one day, hopefully sooner than later, um, get away from this very traditional strength training approach. Um, I don't think we're far off from like top level teams going away from your traditional lifts and seeing more of this in there. And and it's I mean the concept has been around for ages, right? But if I can liken it to the you know when a player gets injured, we know this principle of the Rice principle: rest, ice, compress, elevate, right? And that is embedded into sport. And I don't see it changing. I hope it does. But the same guy that came up with this Rice principle came out to say, sorry, my principle is actually flawed, right? But it's so embedded into professional sports that I don't think we're going to see a change. But with that said, I think I mean, you're seeing NBA teams do it already. You're seeing a lot of top teams using like aqua bags, using all this like perturbation stuff. And I don't think we're far away from yeah traditional lifts slowly phasing out and more sport specific training coming in. Like yes, there are elements, let's say in American football, for example, where something like a bench press, like yes, there's value to it. Like linemen, they need upper body strength and they need that pushing power. So I can see something like that. But if you like, why would a NBA player, why would a basketball player need to have a extremely big bench? Right? I don't think there's carryover into it. And I think that's where this special strength training or sport specific training is going to start looking more like what they actually need to do rather than it being what you and I are probably used to.
Yeah.
Mm,
So uh so like using those like aquaback or like
mm,
unstable surface or like
mm, mm,
perturbation,
mm,
that like uh the reason why we use that is it because like the thing you mentioned, like let your body to like re re learn this and to be able to like use it in like different situation?
I would say so. I would say so. Yeah. So we're trying to change. I think especially with the let's use the example of the unstable surface. We're trying to change the environment of that, right? So there Bosch talks about this um, the variabilities that we can change. There's the environment, there's a task, and there's an organism, right? And and if we're thinking about the task that needs to be changed, or the organism, that being us, or the environment, when we're talking about unstable surfaces, we're changing the environment of that, right? Um, I I think for me, and unstable surfaces for basketball specifically, I think we need to be careful though of over changing things too. I like the use of unstable surfaces in the context of like ankles and stability of ankles, but when it comes to, let's say, lateral movement, you're not really going to have situations in game where where the surface is unstable, right? And so what we're trying to work with these unstable surfaces is giving the body all these different variables and getting it to figure itself out, I think, simply put. But with that said, variability, there are different levels to it too. I think there is such a thing as too many variables, and that's dependent on the athlete as well, but we obviously don't want to have no variables in our training, because then there's no room to learn. And I think I think that's what it comes down to. How many variables can I give to my athlete for them to be able to learn these different patterns that they haven't been exposed to quite yet.
Yeah, great. Last
Mm,
question
mm.
before I let you go, okay?
Yeah, of course.
So, uh, there's also some movement I saw on the French ball system, and it's
Mm.
combined the hip lock with like different like uh different how do I say this? Like different direction. Like the multi-directional
Yes.
movement we used to like
Oh yeah.
yeah, we used to train our athlete. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
is it kind of the same concept with like linear, but it just like different direction? And
Yeah, yeah.
and how should we like and is it can I try to like replace it with the
Mm.
old traditional movement we use?
Mm, mm. So I with the I think I know which movement you're referring to. It's kind of like this like starting with one leg up, placing it on the ground, and then hip
Yeah.
walking a different direction. So there's a couple elements to that. There's an element of swing leg retraction, which is how well you can use your hamstring to actually bring your foot underneath you to make contact, right? So if we use that exercise, for example, in the context of something like a Euro step, it's important that a athlete, or like that a basketball athlete knows how to get into that hip lock position as soon as that foot hits the ground, right? If we're trying to create a massive amount of force going through the foot into something like a Euro step where you have to go from one direction to the other, an athlete's ability or inability to get into that hip lock position going laterally is going to be the difference between them, let's say, being able to finish at the rim or having to adjust while still in the air, right? And what I mean by that, if you can get more power output, that brings you closer to the rim. If there's less power output, we might need to be finishing under the basket instead. So yeah, very very similar in terms of concept of being able to use a hip lock, but instead of it being, let's say, in a like a linear pattern, you have something that's a little bit more, yeah, like multi-directional, if I can call it that. Now, your question about what can I do to replace it with like the traditional strength movements? Um, it's a great question. I think the closest thing, and I've done this before in a commercial gym, is I haven't been able to replace the multi-directional ones in the gym setting, but with the hip lock, one thing that I like to use sometimes is a Smith machine and just having the bar on my back, and then from there, kind of starting in this hinged over position and then exploding up, right? But I think with that, because there's this external force on our back, that's already causing us to pre-tension, right? Because any sort of force on me is going to get me bracing. And I think the one thing with the Smith machine, or trying to do the hip lock with the Smith machine, is that hardly ever in sport are you going to have this external force pushing down on you before you're trying to do a hip lock, right? I think the only example I could think of is maybe someone going up for a layup and someone actually holding them down and them having to hip lock up. But outside of that, I think that external load almost gives us false pre-tensioning of the body, right? And so if you can be as open chain with your movements and as open with your movements as possible, I think that gives the athlete the best chance possible to have that transfer over into their sport.
Yeah, great.
Mm,
Love that. Love
mm.
that.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
that's kind of like all the questions I have for today. If there's
yeah,
like
good.
coaches or therapists are interested in what we are talking about today, where
Mm.
can they reach out to you and how can they find the post I saw on your Instagram?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I mean, on Instagram, it's Daniel Physio. Again, I'm based in Sydney. So I know most of your audience is probably in the States or around the world. So I know that's a bit of a trek, but yeah, I'm more than happy to chat to people. Love talking about this stuff, and I'm still learning. I'm no expert in all the Franz Bosch stuff. There's so much to unpack in it, but yeah, my main mode of communication is usually Instagram or email. So that's just Daniel Physio, and yeah, more than happy to chat with people about it.
Cool. Great.